everyone, welcome to Module 5, where we're going to talk about strategies for instruction. In this first video, we're going to talk about a wide variety of instructional strategies, and then Amy's video will follow up with some specific instructional strategies for discussion. Let's get started. So in this first section, we're going to talk about identifying different forms of instruction that correspond to different types of learning objectives, understanding the benefits of active learning, and you'll begin to implement strategies for active learning in your classroom. So let's talk about different types of instruction. So we've probably seen a wide variety of different types of instruction over our educational careers, with the kind of mainstays always being lectures and discussions. And we can imagine kind of lecture and discussion working in a variety of ways. Discussions particularly could be large group or small group discussions, Q&A type discussions. Other types of instruction include peer instruction, so students educating each other, instructing each other, so student presentations, individual or group, for example. We can also think about workshops, labs, and studios. So I think we're used to labs and studios fitting into the STEM model for labs or the art model for studios. But I think that thinking about this kind of hands-on learning for students where they're learning in the classroom with the instructor there as a guide. So there's peer instruction going on where students are working together in a group, helping each other out, figuring out problems together. But there's also the instructor is there as a guide to give instruction, to help students along the process. So we can think about, particularly with ancient studies folks, whether you're in history or philosophy or literature or language, or any of the other variety of specialties types of courses that we see, we can have writing workshops or case studies or just students working through homework together. We also have service learning or internships or other types of hands-on learning that takes place outside of the classroom as a method of instruction. We can also think about our readings or viewings or whatever you're assigning as homework as part of instruction and something to kind of keep in mind when you're thinking about instruction for your class. As well as things like office hours and study sessions, right? All of these inside the classroom, outside the classroom, all play a role in how we're teaching students and how we're filling that instructor role. So the main thing we have to consider with all of these different types of instruction is how they align with our course learning objectives. So if we remember back to Module 1, one of the things we talked about right at the beginning of that module was thinking about how your learning objectives align with your assessments and with your instructional strategies. So we brought up an alignment matrix at some point. So one of the things we want to make sure, right, is that if we have particular objectives for a course, that students are able to reach them by the end. So we want to make sure that not only our assessments, that is the assignments that students are doing, but also our instruction is all leading students toward success down that path so that they're reaching the objectives by the end. So what we don't want to have is a misalignment of objectives where we only engage in one particular type of instruction, but it's not ideal for getting students to a particular goal or helping them succeed on a particular type of assessment. So that's one of the things we have to kind of consider as we're working through, as we're thinking through the different types of instruction that we want to use in a course. And one particular instructional model that I want to talk about is active learning. So what is active learning? Basically, the idea of active learning is that we're trying to get students involved and engaged in the learning process. We want them not to be sitting passively during any of these types of instruction, but instead engaging actively. And we can contrast the active learning model with what we'll call a more traditional model of learning. Looking at this chart, we recognize, all the way from back from Module 1, Bloom's Taxonomy, where we have different types of learning tasks that we want our students to be able to achieve, organized into different categories. And remember, one of the things we talked about is like this pyramid, hierarchical pyramid is maybe sometimes helpful, maybe other times not so helpful. And you can go back and review in Module 1 the different ways this has been visualized. But I like it here because it helps us think about dividing these tasks up and what the traditional model is really useful for and what the active learning model is really useful for. So in the traditional model, new information is conveyed through passive didactic. That is usually just through lecture, where a lecturer is addressing students, but there's not a lot of students talking back or engaging back in the process. And this is particularly useful for understanding and remembering tasks. But all other tasks, application, analysis, evaluation, creation, are all tasks that our students are expected to achieve any of these levels of learning outside of the classroom, outside of the purview of the instructor, entirely on their own. So we can think about, paper writing, completely outside of class, often in a traditional model, without any kind of extra instruction from the instructor within class, right? In an active learning model, on the other hand, there are various formats of interaction that promote discussion and application of learned material, or that are responsive to individual students' levels of understanding, with all of these creation, evaluation, and analysis and application tasks, right? That means what you're doing in the classroom is focused on these higher order tasks that are asking students to engage with material, whereas these kind of what we might think as lower order tasks, right? Understanding or remembering tasks are all focused on self-directed learning outside of the classroom. Obviously with the instructor providing, as it says, providing aids here, right? Providing the book, providing video lectures, providing things like that. But the idea is that the active part, the in-class part, where you're really getting to engage with the instructor, is all happening in the classroom. Where you're working on these higher order tasks with the instructor and with other students together. The benefits of active learning, there are many. I've actually borrowed this whole cloth from the Why Do Active Learning that's featured on page that's featured on Queen's University's website, because they give a lot of citations that I wanted to borrow. So increased knowledge, content knowledge, critical thinking and problem solving abilities, and positive attitudes towards learning in comparison to traditional lecture-based delivery. Increased enthusiasm for learning in both students and instructors. Development of graduate capabilities such as critical and creative thinking, problem solving, adaptability, communication, and interpersonal skills, and improved student perceptions and attitudes towards information literacy, which is something I feel like we would all like our students to have improved attitudes towards. So there's a lot of benefits to active learning, and they're really, really well documented. That's one of the things that we really know, is that engaging students more in the process of learning is always going to be beneficial for them and often for the instructor as well. So let's talk about some strategies for active learning. And one of the things I want to note right off the bat is that many of these strategies can be used for any type of instruction. They can be used during lecture, they can be used during discussions, they can be used for more hands-on learning, workshops, whatever. The idea, right, is not that we have to only use one type of instruction, but instead that we can incorporate active learning strategies into whatever instructional type you feel is working best for you, your material, and your students. So let's think through some of these strategies, some of which may appear familiar to you. So things like think, pair, share, where you have students, you ask students a question, or you have them reflect on something for a minute or two. You have them pair up with someone else in the class and discuss what they reflected on, and then share with a larger group. I've done this successfully in classes of up to 300 students. So I know that this is something that can actually work. And doing an activity like this is something that can allow, during a lecture, for example, students to stop and really engage. They have to kind of stop and think for a minute, rather than just kind of furiously copying notes. And it often engages students whose minds may be wandering as well. We can also think about things like any other self-assessment or reflection activities, minute papers, for example. You have students kind of write out an answer to a question, or muddiest point. You have students at the end of a lecture or at some point during a lecture write down what they one question. What do they think? What is the thing that they're not quite sure about? What is the muddiest point from the things that you just talked about for the last 45 minutes? And then that's something you can either address right there after students hand them in, or at the beginning of the next lecture. You can also think about Q&A, right, as a model for still kind of a lecture-based course, but opening up for questions. And also strategies like teaching students how to actively take notes. There's a lot of data also about effective note-taking and how it really can change a student from kind of a passive model of learning to a more active, engaged model of learning. So even just kind of teaching students, instructing them on how to take notes can really, really help. So all of these are things that I've employed successfully in lecture-based courses, but also can work for discussion-based courses. Anytime I'm having students, anytime in a discussion course, when I get I ask a question and it's just kind of crickets, I can immediately say, okay, well, everybody think about this for a minute, and then pair up with a partner, and then we're going to share, right? So doing think, pair, share can really kind of work in any environment. As well as all of these other methods they don't just have to be for lectures. They can also work in other ways. We can also think about student response tech, probably most appropriate for lecture courses, especially at least for the clickers and the apps and things like that have students respond to a question and a poll style question. But also, one of the things that I've really, really liked having in my discussion courses while we've been on Zoom for the last year has been back-channel chat, right? Having students, while we're talking over a particular topic, having students who, want to particularly respond to something someone's saying right now, right? Get to type it into the chat. You can also think about things like shared docs. One of those note-taking tips can be to have students collectively take notes in a shared doc, or even incorporating social media, live tweeting lectures or live tweeting particular classes I've seen employed to great effect. Things like small or large group discussion or problem solving, basically that discussion or that workshop format where students are really are responsible for the knowledge creation in class. Having student presentations or other sorts of peer instruction are something that's also really can be effective for active learning, where students are really getting engaged. Things like role-playing, just not something I've done personally a lot before, but there are a lot of resources. You can particularly look at reacting to the past is something I know some folks in classics have particularly used for to great effect. And then also things like the flipped classroom, which I'll talk about more in a minute, or experiential learning, right, where we're getting students really hands-on experience where they're actively engaging rather than just absorbing material like a sponge. So these are our kind of some active learning strategies. There are plenty more, but that's all that would fit. And I think that that may be enough to absorb for right now. And one of the things that we can think about, right, is that they do also operate on that Bloom's taxonomy, right? Where some active learning strategies are going to be more helpful for certain types of tasks or certain types of learning than others. So I liked this because it kind of helped us move from the simple, just a simple pause for reflection or simple minute paper where students are just responding to a question, to more complex, right, experiential learning, or role-playing, right, where they're doing more complex tasks versus simpler tasks. And that's one of the things that you ought to consider, I think, when thinking about how you want to employ active learning strategies in your own instruction. It depends on what your goals are. So one thing I do want to address in particular is the flipped classroom. The flipped classroom is in contrast to this traditional model, similar to what I discussed earlier, where students in class absorb information through a lecture that doesn't have much of a way of engagement, whereas homework activities All of those higher order learning tasks are all performed at home on their own. The flipped classroom reverses this, right? Where those remembering tasks, that kind of absorbing information, those lower order tasks all take place at home. So either a video lecture or through readings or something like that. Outside of classrooms, so students are interacting with new material outside of class. And then class time is actually reserved for active learning activities. They're practicing new skills, they're asking questions, they're applying new material. And the benefits of this, right, is that it's very student-centered. It's allowing students to learn at their own pace, to engage with the material. They're not trying to keep up with a lecture. They could pause a lecture, or they could get up from their book for a minute. And when they have the instructor in the classroom, they can kind of use that time more effectively to be applying that information and have the instructor there as a guide and to ask questions and things like that. And one of the great things about the flipped classroom is that it encourages self-directed learning, that students are really figuring out how to answer their own questions in class. Because they've got the instructor there as a guide, but the whole point of the classroom instruction is that they're figuring out how to use their resources, whether it's each other, whether it's a textbook, whether it's the internet, to figure out how to solve a particular problem, rather than starting their homework, getting 10 minutes into it, and getting frustrated and quitting until they can get their questions asked in class the next day. This model of the flipped classroom is really, really valuable, can be really valuable for a variety of types of instruction, for a variety of types of classes. But I think a lot of this kind of instruction may seem familiar to those of us who've done a lot of language courses. For anyone who's taught discussion sections or things like that, this should feel pretty familiar. But there's always ways in which we can incorporate flipped classroom techniques even into larger classes. And there are resources that we can recommend for that as well, if that's something folks are interested in. So another element here, and this is the last thing I'm going to talk about, is how we prepare our students for active learning. One of the things you may notice as you start incorporating active learning strategies is that some students can be really resistant to this type of active learning, right? They've gotten used to the system, the traditional system, right, where they want to act as a passive sponge. And in fact, one of the things that we find is that students actually, when polled, will say that they learn more in a lecture-based traditional model course than in a course that's providing more active learning opportunities. However, what their assessments say is that students actually learn more when they're engaging with these active learning opportunities. So that's one of the things that we kind of come across, right? Students are so used to a traditional model that they think that they are not learning as much when they're engaging with active learning, but they're learning more. So one of one of the most important things to prepare students for this is to explain why you're doing it, to explain that fact. So one of the things I definitely recommend is explaining the rationale for a particular activity. Telling students, the reason I want you to engage in this activity in this way is because it's going to help us develop the analytical skills that we're going to need for writing that final paper, or that you're going to need for your final project. So explaining kind of the rationale for the activity and how it ties in to those learning objectives or those assessments that we're practicing, right? They're getting hands-on experience, and I think explaining it in that way can often be really helpful. As well as giving clear instruction. So this is one of the other things that students tend to find frustrating about active learning, is that they're expected to engage in activity that they're not used to, right? They're used to passively sitting and maybe taking notes during lecture, but that's it, right? So giving clear instructions on how you want them to perform this particular activity, including time limits, right? If they're going to think for 2 minutes and then share with a partner for 2 minutes, and then we're going to discuss this in big group discussion for 8 minutes or something like that, right? That kind of idea, so that students know precisely what they're doing. So clear instructions, explaining the rationale for an activity, making sure you set ground rules for student interaction. So that's one of the things that Amy's going to talk about in the next video, how to come up with good discussion guidelines for students. And one of the things to really focus on would be debriefing after each activity to help consolidate what students have learned, so that you are doing that share part of the Think, Pair, Share, where students are sharing back what they have learned, so that you're debriefing after each activity to help students kind of understand what it is that they just did in completing the activity. As well as focusing. So not trying to overdo it, I think, in terms of active learning, especially if your course tends to adhere to a more traditional model. So really focusing active learning activities on the most important elements of learning. What do I most want students to get out of class today? Or what do I particularly want students to practice this week before they have to write that paper or work on this exam or work on this project, things like that. And then finally, don't be afraid to experiment. One of the things you'll find is that if you Google active learning strategies, you will find 1,000,001 of them. So seeking around, if Think, Pair, Share doesn't work for you, find something else. There's lots and lots of things for you to try, lots of things to experiment with. And you can experiment with them in a variety of ways. You can adapt them in a million ways, so that they best suit you and your instructional model, and your material and your students and your class. There's a lot of different ways that these can be implemented and adapted. So I really encourage you to try this out. We've got a reflection activity with a few questions, as you're probably used to by now, but that's it for now. See you later.